Today we're talking about damage versus defense items in solo lane. More specifically, we're focusing on the early game choices, especially in the slot after boots. We'll also look at some other choices like the item after that, but primarily we'll talk about the moment where you'd usually have your third item, often being Breastplate of Valor. Now, I know that especially at lower ranks, people often tend to think that building damage early is also a really good choice, and this is what I kinda want to address in this video. What we're gonna do first is compare 3 items that could be built after your starter item and finishing your boots. We'll assume in this case an Erlang Shen with Death Toll and boots, Warrior Tabi, versus a Sun Wukong with Bluestone Pendant and Warrior Tabi. What we'll do here is do the different values for building Breastplate, building Hydra's Lament, and building Jotunn's Wrath in the next spot. So first, let's look at the defense of the Erlang Shen. The Erlang Shen will be the target of the Sun Wukong. Now, if Erlang Shen was to go for a damage item in third slot, then he would have no defense. He would have a little bit of health due to Death Toll, but in reality, he wouldn't really have any defensive extra stats. And if we're talking about a level 9 here, it may not be the exact level where you get these items, but should be roughly, right? Then you would have 47 protections. If he now was to build Breastplate of Valor, instead of a damage item, he would have 122 protections, physical protections. So there's a quite significant difference here. If you look at the damage numbers that Sun Wukong does against that, then there is quite a significant difference. The damage from 2 basic attacks would be 229. The damage from a combo of Sun Wukong's 1 and 2 would be 233 against an Erlang Shen with no defense. So a total damage of 462. Now, if that Erlang Shen had built Breastplate of Valor instead, the damage from the 1 and 2 would be 154, the 2 basic attacks would be 151. So the total damage would be 305. That means, by building Breastplate of Valor, Erlang Shen reduces the damage that he receives from Sun Wukong's attacks, assuming that Sun Wukong has Breastplate of Valor himself, by 157. Keep this number in mind, this is going to be important. Now, what if Sun Wukong did not build Breastplate of Valor third, but built a damage item with cooldown reduction instead? We look at the 2 options. First, Jotunn's Wrath, because that's that one that you see a little more, even though Hydra's has gained popularity. When we look at Jotunn's, let's now focus on the enemy having Breastplate of Valor, because the scenarios where the enemy will not have Breastplate of Valor are relatively limited. In this scenario, the 1 and 2 combo now deals 171 damage. The 2 basic attacks deal 194 damage. So in total, you deal 365 damage. That is 60 more damage than if you were to build Breastplate of Valor. So you have a 60 damage increase while taking at least 157 more damage, if not more. Because if we compare the damage difference or the defense difference for Erlang Shen here, then the difference between having no Breastplate of Valor and having Breastplate of Valor is 200 damage. So that means that if you were to not build defense against someone with Jotunn's Wrath, you'd even take more damage in comparison. A lot of this is down to the fact that Jotunn's Wrath has flat penetration. Flat penetration really doesn't do much against high protection values, and Breastplate of Valor alone catapults you past 100 protections. The item that you would want here would be Titan's Bane, but Titan's Bane really isn't a good early choice because it doesn't have cooldown reduction, it doesn't give you mana, it's just against tanky targets in general. Now let's look at Hydra's Lament just for comparison's sake. Hydra's Lament, the damage you get from the 1 and 2 combo would be 164. If you hit both basics with the Hydra's Lament amplification from the passive, it would be 200 damage. So the total damage here would be 364, which is even less damage than Jotunn's Wrath. Actually, 1 damage less. So you get a benefit of 59 damage here, while still having at least to take 157 damage more, if not more, depending on what the enemy builds. To round this up a little bit, for the extra damage you deal, you'll take 3 times more extra damage from your enemy if you were to not build any defense. And people prioritize damage way too much in general. Damage is very nice, especially in roles that need that, especially junglers, for example, need that for the early clear. But most solo lane guards, most guards that you pick in solo in the first place, have no issues clearing with their abilities. All they need is a little bit of mana and cooldown reduction, and that's what Breastplate of Valor will provide you with. There are other choices as well. If you have a more basic attack focused guard, you can also go for Witchblade, for example. It's nothing that completely is out of the window, but going for straight damage instead of any sort of defense early on, basically, most of the time will lose you the lane because you're not going to be able to trade with an enemy that goes into defense. But that's only in 3rd slot. Now what about 4th slot? In 4th slot, I would still generally recommend building defense, maybe something combined with cooldown reduction. I think Spirit Robe is a great item for most solo laners, or something more situational like anti-healing, stuff like that, Pestilence. But if you were to compare damage items in the 4th slot, you would come to a, somewhat surprising result as well. Or not surprising for those who've actually looked at protections and how they work, but surprising for those who just look to build maximum CDR. Because if you compare Jotunn's Wrath and Titan's Bane, then you will realize that the full damage for 2 basic attacks and your 1+2 combo on Sun Wukong with Jotunn's Wrath would be 365 damage, whereas if you were to build Titan's Bane instead, the same combo would be 413 damage. Now obviously, Jotunn's has the upside of having some extra mana, but you should be all set with Breastplate of Valor. It also has the upside of extra cooldown reduction, which is why most people build it. But I would personally much rather go for some other defensive item with cooldown reduction. And if you really need the extra damage as a solo laner, which most don't even do, then go for Titan's Bane. You could even go Titan's Bane in 4th slot and then build another CDR defense item after that. I think generally solo laners, if they're playing frontline, should not be investing too much into damage, and as such, especially items like Jotunn's that are focused on early burst really don't have much of a place there. The only reason to really build it would be being terribly ahead and having every window to kill the enemy and just wanting to abuse that, but chances are you're not going to be that ahead unless your opponent is really terrible at the game. Now, let's look at some reasons to still build defense, especially early on. It will give you a clear advantage. That's something that's worth keeping in mind. Regardless of everything else, it will give you a bit of a clear advantage. If you're just looking for clear, then a little extra damage will go a long way. At the same time, you're going to take more poke while clearing, so for most guards, that's not really an option. It is a choice for safe farmers and hyper carries. There's one character that comes to mind here, which is Loki. Loki kind of needs those items, and Loki doesn't need defense. He doesn't want to build defense in his kit early on. It doesn't fit his playstyle. It doesn't fit his scalings and stuff like that. So he's better off building into damage. But at the same time, you see why Loki lost a little bit of popularity there. He can't really do much against an enemy that's going into early defense unless he gets an early lead. So all he can do is proxy farm, safe farm, all that stuff, which is what Loki does 90% of the time. For that, it doesn't really matter what he builds, because Loki has good ways of getting away from the enemy, not taking too much poke. He can basically kill her in a tower for free without getting in trouble, so why would he? And as such, there is a point in building it there. There are also other hyper carries who could easily go into damage. Thinking of Bakasura here, Bakasura simply has that true damage in his kit, which is why attack speed will always benefit him and blah 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 blah. But then again, it's so rare to see either mages or Bakasura or anything in the solo lane really at the moment, so that's not really worth discussing in depth. There's one last item that I'd like to point out here, which is Ikaival. Ikaival has been picked up even in the SPL a few times. I think namely Zelia did it on Erlang Shen. There is a logic behind that. Especially if you're a god that has a Death Toll, the extra attack speed will benefit you. It will allow you to sustain more in lane because you're healing up more. If you have an AoE swing in your kit, then even better. And it will allow you to trade relatively well with the enemy because it doesn't only give you extra damage and extra penetration, but also lowers the enemy's damage. Yet still, I would generally recommend against it. It is possible, but not for most. The power steal is something you need to utilize properly, and you will still take plenty of poke if you're not constantly in your enemy's face. And even in the SPL, it has often not worked out as it was planned to. Really, a highly skilled solo laner with enough idea of how to play defensive and how to avoid getting constantly poked down will probably be able to counterplay that. There are gods that still benefit a lot from it, for example Arachne as well, but overall I would say the real benefit of Ikaival versus defense items isn't really there, so you have to be very certain of what you're doing if you want to do that. So, in conclusion, defense in solo lane usually gets you or nets you 3 times more than damage in solo lane early on, if you're specifically speaking about Jotunn's Wrath versus Breastplate of Valor. Now, this cannot always be translated into every matchup, but 90% of the time, I would recommend going defense over any aggressive item in the 3rd slot after finishing your boots, which will typically be an aggressive choice with Warrior Tabi for pretty much any solo laner that you currently see in that lane. Only really consider building damage if you are very ahead, or you're playing one of the characters that is absolutely not looking to box at all and is just looking to farm for late game or whatever. With that, I hope this clears up a few things about solo lane. Thank you guys for watching. I will see you all for the next one tomorrow. Duke SLOTH, out.